So the thing about this post, if no one watched or read this post before, this is like, in some ways he was giving his thoughts on like what an RTS ought to be. But then he also kind of just gave his rating of how RTS were and what he thought was good and bad, which I think is a good way of presenting what RTS ought to be when you look back at what RTS was. So I won't go through all the ratings in every single one because I think they feel pretty arbitrary. Every now and then he says a reason why he likes or doesn't like something, and I think those are the much more interesting parts. So we'll kind of read through this and then we'll kind of skim to what I remember to be the highlights, and then we'll kind of reach the conclusion. Now, okay, well, this was the first thing I knew for a fact that was really interesting, or that I noticed personally when I read this, was Warcraft 3 Space Control 3 out of 10. So this was something I didn't ever think about until he mentioned it. This was actually a big mind blower for me. Was that actually it makes complete sense. So he says perhaps the biggest failure of Warcraft 3 is its lack of importance in space control. Important objectives for the players to protect on maps includes creep camps, fountains, certain shops. However, there's little emphasis on holding chokes, high grounds, or any tactical position. There are many options to choose from as far as AoE spells or units, but with high HP units, most battles turn into brawly skirmishes that aren't highlighted or used nearly as much as they could be. Or these aren't highlighted as much as, or used as much as they could be. The reason why this is really interesting to me is, man, I remember in HOTS, like people making tons of mods, all sorts of mods for StarCraft 2, talking about how this is going to be the new best thing and how their version of the game was better because they would do these tweaks. And, you know, besides just making the race that they made absolutely broken, one of the things a lot of people would do is they just make everything a lot more hit points. Because people viewed how quick fights were as such a bad thing, and it just needed to be longer. They weren't fun because they would just end in a couple storms, or now I guess you could say disruptor shots and things like that, and it was seen as pretty just flat rate negative. But Huck actually says the opposite, where he hates how it's just brawly skirmishes, and it seems like AoE doesn't really do that much. And most importantly, I think, more than anything, he says how little holding chokes and high grounds actually matter. Because if you have vision, that's fine, as long as you aren't getting choked out and all your units can attack, you're good. And that's something important to think about, because while having really fast fights can be really uninspiring and demotivating when you're losing the fight, especially, having something that's super long is kind of the opposite end of the spectrum. And I kind of do feel like Warcraft 3 fights end up a little too long sometimes. So I thought that was pretty interesting. As far as the rest of it goes, it's kind of what you expect. The races are all pretty different. AoE 2 supports one of the most diverse balance of resources: food, wood, gold, and stone, all unique and have their own special use. Don't fret, however, as soon as a player can have a market, they not only rebalance their economy, but also make up for any ground lost by lack of a particular resource. Although at an inflated price, markets in AoE 2 are used by professionals and newbies alike, granting the ability to customize resources to a specific strategy, i.e. Castle Rush, and they can help their macro. This is actually I completely missed this. This is the thing about the really good thing that Age of Empires does. While I don't really like how many resources they have, and I feel like it can be just another thing to worry about, like my experience with Age of Empires 2, just getting into it, I'd have problems where I couldn't quite remember when to get stone, and then oh no, I have too much stone, and then now I'm, maybe I guess I'll make 2 castles instead of 1. Or I'd have the opposite problem where I'm just like, oh crap, I just have so much everything else and I really need a castle right now on top of this hill, or I'm in big trouble. And I think the point about a market is really good, but I kind of wish that there wasn't so many resources. Maybe if we could find a middle ground there, I would really enjoy that, but maybe 3 resources with a market is not enough. I'm not sure. I'm not really sure. I haven't thought about the market too much, but market is a really good newbie friendly thing that you can do that would get the skill floor lower while not jeopardizing the high level play, and in fact he even says it can add strategy to the higher level play because they can do things with it, and that can make it fun for everybody. Whereas I think a lot of people say stuff like we need to make the economy easier, and they're not thinking exactly in that way, right? Like it's just easier, but then, you know, while say if this was the skill floor and this was the skill ceiling, a lot of people kind of wanted like moved together. But I think there is, in some cases, I think market is a good example of, you know, we just make the skill floor lower, and then we're still keeping the skill ceiling, maybe even making them both a little bit wider. Okay, so this is interesting. I kind of want to hear, I don't remember what he said about economy resource. He says there should be at least 3 to 4 different resource types. 2 is too bland and boring. Market from AoE 2 is a great way to rebalance it. Helps casual players. Okay, oh, this is, I guess it was call-in mechanics is what he called it. It wasn't mercenaries was the word. Also, Company of Heroes 1's call-in mechanics for specialized units not only is fun, but helps casual players with spending the resources. Macro mechanics should be minimalized as they generally are generally seen as boring and tedious. I mean, while I don't really agree that you should have 3 to 4 resource types, I think this is like 3 to 4 resource types is like, I think this is definitely coming from someone who's played StarCraft 2 a lot and just wants more shit. I don't think this is necessarily good for casual players, and I don't think necessarily market is the band-aid that makes it better. I think it's like an okay thing if like we're in a situation where we have 4 resources. Sure, let's put a market to fix it, but I don't think it really does. But I will say the call-in mechanics thing, the first thing I imagined in my mind was those mercenaries in the StarCraft 2, like these little mercenary buildings around the map, right? They have some maps like that, and I think that would be really cool, not only for simply a newer player floating and they're like, shit, I'll just make some mercs, but maybe as long as these aren't too strong, maybe there's a strategy where you make a bunch of mercs and you all in. That could be something that would be kind of fun. So he kind of throws a lot of bombs at the end. He says, he gives us 2 cents on resources. He gives some ideas on how to deal with macro mechanics, which I think are very valuable. But then also he kind of brings in the game mode of like, maybe we shouldn't be 1v1 anymore, which I have a lot of thoughts on about 1v1 versus team games and stuff. I might make that a whole nother separate thing because I think that's maybe out of scope of this. But personally, I feel a little bit of knee-jerk reaction where I kind of don't like it. I kind of feel like StarCraft has a good corner in esports that we're the 1v1 game. I know fighting games also face a similar problem where they're kind of like, maybe we would have been popular if we were a team game somehow. How can we incorporate that into the fighting game genre? And a lot of the same problems people talk about in fighting games exist in RTS with being a 1v1 game is very difficult. It's very difficult to get into because the learning curve is so steep, and you're all alone, and there's a lot of ladder anxiety. And what was the other thing? There's solo queue, learning curve, and this the APM is just absolutely too high. But I think so I have some thoughts about this because this is a great post, I think, in a lot of ways, but I think it ends up feeling a little bit empty because he puts a lot of thoughts out here like you know, APM is too important, the learning curve is too high, and being solo is a terrible experience, right? And I think he addresses the 2 out of 3, at least in my eyes, with he's like, okay, well maybe it should be team games so you can be with your buddy and that'll make it better. So there's no solo experience anxiety. We could do these macro mechanics to fix the learning curve, right? Which I think those are definitely ways to do it, but I think they don't quite hit the mark. I think as far as economy, I think his thoughts on economy are pretty spot on. you know, if we just take StarCraft 2 and then we make it 2v2 focused, it's not going to be that good, because there's really not a lot of synergy between you and me in StarCraft 2. But if you build a game around synergy, it could be very cool, which is why I'm kind of on the fence about 2v2. Like, my instincts are to say it shouldn't be 2v2, but I also can see it being very good. What I will say about team games is, just because you're playing with your buddy doesn't necessarily mean it'll be better than, like, it doesn't mean you'll necessarily play longer than playing with yourself, just by yourself. And I think a lot of things are at play here. It's like team games not necessarily would lower the floor. I think it's just a band-aid solution for the real problem, which is that the game isn't fun. If the game, I think quite simply, if the game is fun and it's worth going through the struggle of learning the thing, it will just be worth it regardless of if you're by yourself or if you're with somebody else. And that's what people need to focus on, is making a game actually worth it. Because everyone's worried about tricking people into playing games. It's almost like we don't even believe that our game is good. We're talking about like Frost Giants and stuff, for example, a game that isn't even made yet. We don't even call it by its name. We call it by the studio it was created by, a non-existent game. People are talking about like, we need lower skill floor, which is, you know, I don't necessarily disagree, and we need team games and we need all these things to get more people, and it's like almost like right off the bat we're trying to trick people into playing. I think simply if you make the game worth it, that'll make a huge difference, because StarCraft 2 is not a perfect game and there's so much that could be improved upon. I think in a lot of ways it's irreplaceable, along with a couple different fighting games, because it's just that 1v1 game that everyone goes to when they're sick of the team game experience on League of Legends or something like that. Does it need to be like that though? I don't necessarily think it has to be the 1v1 game forever. I think I could be happy in a game where it's just 2v2 focused and whatnot, but I think it's important to go into it being 2v2 because we have this cool new idea for these teammates to, you know, synergize and create new strategies that no one's ever done in RTS, and not because, oh god, we need more players. How can we get more players? We need them to have friends. It's such a desperate attempt at getting new people to play that never played RTS, and it's sad because RTS isn't that bad. You know, even when we're talking about new IPs, we're, you know, like I said, we're talking about getting them to play with their friends and not how to make the game actually fun. So I'm on the fence about teams in a lot of ways, but I do think why people want teams is important. It's very, very important to me.